Hello. This week's topic is the Constitution. We're going to be reading from Chapter 2 in the book. Please make sure you pay attention to the reading assignments that I'll send you by email so you know specifically which pages you need to read from Chapter 2. But I want to give you a little bit of background so that as you're reading the chapter, you have a little bit more information about some of the topics that are covered in the chapter. So we are talking about the U.S. Constitution. Now, the U.S. Constitution is the fundamental law of our nation. It is sometimes called the supreme law of the country because it is binding on all the states. Originally, there were 13 states, and we've grown to 50 states, plus Washington, D.C., and some territories. But the Constitution is the law of the land in all of those states and territories. Now, that does not take away from the sovereignty of the states. Under our system of laws and government, states do have sovereignty. Sovereignty is the authority to govern. And so, under our Constitution, states do have their own sovereignty. They can govern themselves on a number of issues. But our Constitution that has been in existence since 1787 provides for a system of shared sovereignty in this country. The concept of shared sovereignty is also known as federalism. It means there are two levels of government, each of which has the authority to pass laws on the people or for the people. Now, when we get to Chapter 3, we'll talk more about what federalism is and what it's not, and how it operates, and that sort of thing. But just so you know, the U.S. Constitution was created the first system of federalism of any country in the world. Prior to the U.S. Constitution, countries had different forms of government, unitary or confederate forms of government, but we created a system of shared sovereignty in our Constitution. And I'll talk more about that when we get into the next chapter, Chapter 3. But for this topic, I want to talk a little bit about the background of the Constitution. So, as you probably know, we were prior to 1776, the United States was under British rule. There were 13 colonies in North America that were aligned to Great Britain. Colonies do not have sovereignty; they don't have the authority to govern themselves, so they depend on the home government for their laws and for the right to even exist. Now, for most of the time that Britain controlled the colonies, which was from the early 1600s until the 1760s, there really wasn't much interference. The colonies kind of did their thing, and the British government largely stayed out of the affairs of the colonies because it didn't make any sense for them to get involved. But in the 1760s, Great Britain had fought a very expensive war with France, known as the 7 Years' War. And at the end of that conflict, Britain said, we need money. And so they looked at the colonies. The 13 American colonies were all doing very well economically. Now, it should be noted that a lot of the economic success of the colonies in the 1760s was a result of slave labor, particularly in the southern states or southern colonies at that point. So that's something that you should always remember, that slavery did exist and was very common in the colonies. And certainly when you're not paying your workers and abusing them and torturing them and killing them, you can make a lot of money. Now, you can also argue that, and I would argue that you're going to be a lot more prosperous long term if you are paying workers and treating them as human beings, but that was not the case in that period. So American slavery did help a lot of the colonies, particularly the southern ones, to be very prosperous at that time. So going back to the issues, in the 1760s, Great Britain decided that it would start taxing the colonies, and there's the famous tax on tea, which led to the Boston Tea Party. There was a tax placed on lead, on paper, on a number of products that were made in the colonies. And the colonists were upset because they said, we don't have any representation in the British Parliament. As colonists, they had their own colonial legislative bodies, but they did not have any representation in London in the British Parliament, which was passing the laws. And then at that time, the British king, King George III, was really ruled with a very strong hand. Today, the British monarch is more of a figurehead, but at that time, the British monarch did have some powers, although they were limited in many ways by the Parliament, but the monarch still retained a lot of power. And so King George started not just enforcing the taxes on the colonists, but also started depriving colonial subjects of their due process rights. So he tossed them into jail without representation or being charged with a crime, and deprived them of the basic rights they should have had as citizens of Britain. So at the end of about a 10-year period of these laws, taxes, abuses, the colonists decided they'd had enough, and they began the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. And then in 1776, July 4th, which is a date that is very familiar to us, the colonists declared their independence from Great Britain. July 4th, 1776 is the day the Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson wrote, and explained to the world why we were now separate from Great Britain. So from July 4th, 1776 onward, the colonies were now states, independent states, 13 of them at the time, and were considered to be sovereign powers independent of any rule by any other country. And so that's why we always celebrate our birthday as a country on July 4th. Now, of course, we still had to win the Revolutionary War. There were still a lot of things that had to happen, and that's discussed in your reading. But after the colonies declared their independence and became states, they recognized they needed to join together to defend themselves and to fight the Revolutionary War. And so within a few years of independence, they established what was called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was America's first governing document. It was our first constitution, but it pretty much gave most of the authority for government to the states. Now that they were independent and sovereign, the states really didn't want to give up any power. And so they established this very loose confederation of states. A confederation really is a form of government where most of the power rests at the lower level, and the national or central government is relatively weak. And that was certainly the case with the Articles of Confederation. We had one institution of national government, a unicameral Congress. Unicameral means one house, and each state had one vote in the Congress, regardless of the state's population. So it was a very weak central government, no executive authority, no judicial authority, and almost everything was handled at the state level. Now, in the few years that this document was in place as our Constitution, we had a lot of problems. There was no the national government had no ability to tax, so it was constantly running out of money. The states imposed tariffs on each other, so they would place taxes on each other's products, which led to trade disputes among the states. There was no uniform currency for the nation, money. So states would, when they would run out of money, would print more, which leads to high inflation, which made money very worthless in a lot of states. And just it was not, the Articles of Confederation led to a very weak government for the country and a lot of infighting among the states. So in the late 1780s, 1786 and 87, the states decided that they needed to do something to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. So in May of 1787, 55 delegates met in Philadelphia to the reason they originally went to Philadelphia was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but once they got there, they decided that the Articles were kind of beyond hope, and Virginia, which was a leading state and one of the larger states at the time, introduced a proposal known as the Virginia Plan, which essentially provided for a brand new government for the United States. It essentially scrapped the Articles of Confederation, created a much stronger central government that would have authority over taxation. It would have the ability to regulate commerce and issue a central currency for the nation, establish post offices, a military, declare war, all things that we associate with a national government. But the states would keep their sovereignty. So on things that were not given to the central government, they would remain with the states. So public safety, health, education are things that the states primarily deal with. And so that was the Virginia Plan, and that's largely what was adopted at the Constitutional Convention. But one of the most controversial part of the Virginia Plan was the fact that representation in Congress would be based on the population of a state. And we would have a bicameral Congress, that is a two-house Congress, and in both houses, representation would be based on the population. The small states didn't like that, and so they came up with what was called the New Jersey Plan, or the Small State Plan, which essentially would have retained most of the Articles of Confederation and kept the Congress as unicameral with one vote per state. And that was a major dispute. If they had not resolved that, there would not have been a constitution. The dispute was resolved later in that summer of 1787 when Connecticut introduced what came to be called the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, that resulted in a bicameral Congress with a House of a House of Representatives based on population, and a Senate with equal representation for each state, so 2 senators per state. And that is what they agreed to, and that's what we have today. So essentially, the government of the United States that we have today, that's in the Constitution, Article 1 of the Constitution, essentially is the Virginia plan with one major change, and that is we do have a bicameral Congress, House based on population, and the Senate that's equal for each state. So that was the biggest issue they had to deal with. Another major issue at the Constitutional Convention was the differences between the North and the South, primarily about slavery, but also about trade. As I mentioned before, slavery was pretty much a Southern institution, but it did exist around the country, not just in the South. There was never any discussion at the convention about getting rid of slavery. There should have been, obviously, but there was no discussion of it. Many of the northern states had abolitionists, people who wanted to get rid of slavery, but the southern states basically would have walked out of the Constitutional Convention had there been an effort to outlaw slavery. So they never discussed whether slavery would exist. What they did discuss was how to count the slaves, and that led to the infamous 3/5 compromise, which is discussed in your reading, where slaves would count as 3/5 of a person in the census every 10 years. And then the other issue was whether the slave trade could continue, that is, importing enslaved Africans into the United States to become slaves here. And again, we're talking about live human beings that were being traded in the slave trade. And the compromise they reached on that was the slave trade would be allowed to continue until the year 1808, which was 20 years in the future. But after 1808, Congress could put limits on the slave trade. And in fact, they eventually did put a restriction on the slave trade. Now, that the limit they placed on the slave trade in 1808 was not on slavery itself. Slavery continued until after the Civil War, but the trading of human beings in the slave trade did finally end after 1808. So those were 2 compromises on the slavery issue, but never any discussion about whether slavery would exist. It was accepted that it would. And they never used the word slave or slavery in the Constitution. They used euphemisms like other persons, free persons, and so the understanding was that if you were not a free person, you were a slave. But even the framers, many of whom owned slaves, people like George Washington owned slaves, and especially a lot of the Southerners, James Madison, and others who were not at the Constitutional Convention, like Thomas Jefferson, were slave owners. So it's something to know about our history. But they did come up with a compromise. And there were some other compromises that are discussed in the reading. But at the end of that summer of 1787, they had agreed to a constitution. It was approved by the delegates, but it still had to be ratified by states because the states actually had sent them to Philadelphia that summer to come up with changes to the Articles of Confederation, but instead they came up with a new constitution. So it took a number of months, but over the rest of 1787 and into 1788, the states considered this new constitution, and the threshold to get it ratified was 9 states out of 13. And by the summer of 1788, about a year after the convention, the 9th state finally ratified the Constitution so that it could begin to go into effect. But eventually, all 13 states did ratify it. It really would not have worked if some states remained out of it. The Federalist Papers, which were 85 essays written by James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton, were instrumental in getting the Constitution ratified. Madison and Hamilton wrote many of the essays. Jay wrote fewer of them, but Hamilton was really a driver behind those essays. He wrote more of them than Madison. And if you're familiar with the musical Hamilton, which is very popular on Broadway and has toured the country, it's been in Detroit, and it's a very popular musical. That musical is based on the life of Alexander Hamilton, who was never a president of the United States, but was one of the leaders of the country at the time of the Constitutional Convention, was one of the delegates, and was instrumental in getting the Constitution ratified. He would later go on to be the Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. So anyway, that's some background to the Constitutional Convention. Please make sure you read the signed pages that I email you about, and we'll also have some discussion about constitutional amendments, so please make sure you read that as well. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me by email, and we can always set up an appointment to meet on Zoom or some other way. All right, hope you're having a great week. Take care.